My name is Professor Kotsis. I teach art history and the freshman seminar, and I also teach in the honors program here at the University of Puget Sound, and I'm in the Department of Art and Art History. It usually takes longer than you think. It's not a linear process, so you can't just start at point A and get to point B without a circuitous route. Don't panic if you don't have a thesis. Just write and see what comes out of it, and usually a thesis will emerge. But I know that a lot of people get bogged down at that point of, oh my God, I don't know what my thesis is going to be. So often it's good to just have something, anything as a placeholder for the thesis, and then once you work through the writing process, usually a thesis emerges. You can tell that I'm not a native speaker. So when I first started graduate school, it was incredibly difficult for me to write in English. And I realized that it was difficult not just because I was not a native speaker, but I also realized that I was really never taught to write in a critical manner. So when I wrote in Hungary, I virtually never got feedback from anybody on my writing. I could write in a somewhat ambiguous way, getting somewhere without really stating what it was that I was really trying to do, which was an astonishing thing to realize when I was not able to do that anymore in English. And so having to write in a foreign language made me realize that actually my process of writing and thinking wasn't as clear as it should have been. And so adopting to write in English actually forced me to clarify my ideas. And so in my first and second quarters of grad school, I couldn't finish papers. And I had these massive amounts of written pages, but they didn't go anywhere. And it took me actually a long time to realize that it's more than just a language barrier, that it's actually, I have to think about the writing process in a different way, and I actually have to force myself to really state what it is that I'm thinking. The writing process, up until that point, somehow didn't serve me to clarify my ideas. And I suspect that this has to do with my native language and some academic traditions around that, where this kind of clarity that seems to be required in English and American articles and papers was not a requirement. So you could be really murky and still get away with it. And so that was a huge challenge, but at the same time, once I caught on to what was going on, it was incredibly rewarding. So I feel like I can actually write pretty clearly now because I was able to step outside of my own process and look at it from the outside and kind of remedy it. Now, this is difficult to adopt when you are writing in your own language, but if you can somehow find a way to step outside of your process, I don't know, by having somebody else read your work or putting it aside and going back to it with a critical eye, it's amazing what you can learn about yourself that is unclear when you are in the process. You don't have to write long, complex sentences if you can't. Shorter and clear is better. Don't try to go for the Germanic, long, sophisticated sentences, which takes a full paragraph. Just go with clarity. And do not try to translate. Don't try to translate from, say, Chinese to English. Don't write it first in Chinese and translate it. Don't write it first in German and translate it. It will be so much more difficult. And this has to do with different ways of expressing similar ideas in different languages. Sometimes the same concepts didn't even exist in different languages. So if you are trying to translate, that's just going to be painful. And I know that's really hard, especially for people who are not as experienced in writing in a second language, but that's ultimately that's the way to do it. In some ways it's the same thing. It's a never-ending process, so you can always make things better, and sometimes it's very difficult to know when something is finished. I think maybe that's also in some ways a product of how we write these days. When I first was at the university in Hungary, I wrote by hand and then I typed it up on a typewriter, so the process seemed more finite because you couldn't go back and couldn't constantly edit things. So there was a clear sense that, okay, it has to be done, and I can't retype it again and again and again. It's just not going to be feasible. Nowadays, with computers, you can always edit and edit some more and change things around. So I think that that made writing in some ways easier, but also more challenging, because that sense of completeness is so elusive. And I see that in my own work when I send off something to a journal and I think, okay, well, this is a pretty decent draft, and then I come back and it comes back with 2 pages of notes of what I should revise, and then I end up shuffling everything around and cutting this and adding something new to something that I thought was more or less complete. Well, it's pretty foundational. My scholarly work comes usually in the form of articles or presentations at conferences. So really the foundation of the work that I share with other people is in a written form, or it's delivered orally, but based on something that I wrote. So it is absolutely essential. I work with images, but I write about images, and so I can't get around writing. It's just not possible. It's fantastic when I get a good paper and I give comments, and then I get an even better paper, and I have seen that many times. So it is really wonderful to be able to become part of the process of somebody's intellectual development and see what they are capable of. And I have witnessed this a number of times, and it's incredible when I see a student win a writing award or do an incredibly good paper that colleagues tell me about, that so and so did this in a class, and that somehow along the way, maybe not for that paper, but you were kind of part of the process. So seeing that is kind of an amazing thing as this journey.